going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to The Anadromist. This is Burn Power coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia. Not to be confused with the state of Georgia in America. Well, what are we going to do today? You know what we're going to do? We're going to do one more, yet another, How We Got Here. And this time, episode 9. And we're going to deal with the early part of the 90s, which is, in a sense, an extension of the underground of the 80s and how it kind of came up. But before we do that, I want to explain something that I usually never get to till the end, and then I'm usually too exhausted by doing all of this, and I don't feel like coming back and doing a separate thing. So I think what I'll do is I'll explain a little bit of how I make these and my situation here in Georgia. First of all, if you've been here before or if you know what's coming up, then you should hit the like button. Somehow that's helpful. You should subscribe if you haven't already. I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. Have you subscribed yet? If you hit the bell icon, bong, evidently that lets you know on your computer when my stuff goes on. So that could be helpful. And then you could donate a certain amount in order to get what shall we say, extra stuff, extra audio stuff, lectures and other things I've done. And I'm passing a little bit more than 10 hours worth to new people now. I'm working on some other stuff to pass on to people who've been here more than a year, including the lecture I just found of myself in 1980 or 81, which makes me sound like a little child. But evidently what I was saying then was pretty much what I'm saying now. 40 years. Is that really? Anyway, but one thing I wanted to explain, even if I ever do get to 1,000 subscribers and YouTube lets me make any money off their channel, see, I don't make any money off the channel whatsoever in terms of YouTube. YouTube doesn't pay me anything. I don't get any advertising money or anything. And you know what? I probably won't. And the reason for it is, you may have noticed, if you've ever watched any of my videos, that I tend to use a lot of stuff. That is to say, video, audio, whatever stuff from other sources. And I do this, if you look at my first few How We Got Here discussions, you'll notice there's not a lot of extras. And the reason for that was because I was still feeling my way, and so I was just trying to do it off the top of my head. But in truth, if I were doing this with you, let's say that. If I was doing this with you in a live situation, if you were at my house and I say, hey, let me show you some stuff, I would of course use tons and tons of stuff, much more than I even am doing here. I've done these as classes in my homes, not this particular series, but variations on music history or film history or something like that. And I've done other sorts of things, and I use lots and lots of examples because I find it's the best way to get the brain working. Plus, I don't have to talk all the time. Not that I mind talking. I'm very good at it, if you haven't noticed. But what it is, so on YouTube, there's a whole thing about copyright. And the algorithms and the little spider bots that run around YouTube are really, really, really good at finding what I'm using. Occasionally they will completely block it. Recently I found it, even when they block it, if I do a certain little bit of technical gymnastics, they will allow the material to show up in a day. I don't know why they wait a day or two for this, but but let me show you what happens. This is on the last How We Got Here series. This is what happens when I use a lot of examples. And you will notice as we're going along here, lots and lots and lots of stuff. It says, do not monetize, do not monetize. There were 5 or 6 more. I think there were over 20 on this one. And, you know, graciously, I'm allowed to use these things. Once I've had to pay money, and I kind of couldn't get out of it if I wanted to maintain a good relationship or not take the video down. But all these things of you know, if I'm going to do continue doing this kind of stuff, I will never make money on YouTube except for the random video I do without any examples, which I almost always use examples. Or occasionally I will get clever enough. In fact, I'm going to try to get clever at the beginning here. You'll see when I'm just kind of testing to see if I mix up various versions of a song, will the algorithm spot it? But in other words, what I'm trying to say is this. I'm never going to make any money on this. You know what? These videos take, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 hours, and then another 10, 20 or more hours of downloading and transcoding and all this other stuff. Not to forget all the time I spent learning this stuff, which is way beyond anything anyone can calculate. But obviously, you see, well, how can I do this? I do it all in my head first. That's how I do it. I do it in my head. I say, okay, we're doing the early 90s. What do we need? And I just go, and then I put it all down. And then I'll say, oh, I need to find a video for this or a video for that. How about some music there? Whatever. That's how I do it. I don't spend a lot of time looking in books ahead of time because it's all up here. And the reason it's all up here is because I have a huge library back in Alaska where I have spent hours and hours and hours, wasted my life, you could say, listening, reading, watching stuff, going places, listening to people, meeting people. Many of the people we're discussing today are people I've met. So all of that goes into here. Before any editing or anything, it's all here. And I need to get my library here. And I am going to do something like a GoFundMe very soon, and I'd like you to think about contributing to that. But if you would like to donate to the channel before I officially do that, and when I do, you folks will be among the first to know. If you'd like to contribute, though, please feel free. And the reason is that, like I say, if I leave it up to YouTube, I will never make a dime, or it'll just be a little stuff here or there. Occasionally I do something that gets a lot of hits that, it's all my copyright. This has happened on my Gravity from Above channel, where I have some Georgian videos that I have one Georgian video. Is it up to over 100,000 views now? That's amazing. It's 100,000 view. I'm almost at like 910 subscribers. I'm trying to get to the 9,000 mark, 1,000 mark. So I still haven't made a dime on it. Such is life. Anyway, sorry for all of this, but I did want to show you just how much of this stuff gets copyright. Now, I get copyright claims, but not copyright strikes. I don't feel like fighting this stuff. My feeling is, hey, these people made it. If they want a few, the funny thing is if these videos were somehow to take off, if someone at a big channel finally said, oh, you should check out the stuff of Burns, and then all these people came here and suddenly all these people were looking at it, then 15 different companies are going to be trying to get a few pennies on the dime that whatever you get for YouTube. That's life. Okay, enough. Let's start the video. Let's go back in time, shall we? Let's remind ourselves of a little something. We started this in episode 1 and 2 back in World War II and the post-war era, the 1940s and 50s. And there was a certain standard of life then. Now, what I'm doing right now is I'm going to show you images from home movies of that time. Home movies are particularly good because they show you people as they normally dressed. And so we're watching those right now. And what I'd like you to notice is just daily life, the daily rhythms. We've got some imagery here of younger people, of children. We've got imagery of teenagers, got imagery of older folks. We've got imagery of people, in business suits, which was common for everyday life back then. If you went to some event, you'd wear a suit. I am told that farmers back in the day, like in the 30s and 40s and 50s, if they were out in their field on a tractor on a hot summer day, they'd have white shirt, rolled up sleeves, and a button-up shirt, maybe even a tie, which is pretty amazing. I'm showing you these because I want you to, and this is a period that lasts from the end of the war up until, we'll say, a little bit after Kennedy's death. This is a certain kind of America. And I just want you to see these things because I want to show you something else. I want to ask you a question. If you've been following the series, some of you may just have arrived at this one and the 90s interests you, and that's why you're here. Swell. But some of you may actually have started at the beginning, and you will have slowly noticed things changing. Well, tonight the changes come once again. And the early 90s to me is like the late 1960s or the punk era and early rap era in the late 70s, where it's a period where things are suddenly changing again. And what's funny is we don't really have a name for this era. That is to say, we call it the hippie period or the punk era or whatever, but there's no one name for this era. But before we discuss the era, I just want to make a transition here. And the transition is this, is I want you to go from then till the early 90s. And I want you to see what someone filmed of themselves in the early 90s.
You're Susan Day, right?
No, I'm not.
I'm Danny.
No.
What's the one sticker? Have a good time.
It's hard to believe those two things are in the same century, and that is my point. What on earth happened? Well, what on earth happened is everything we have discussed up until this point. Those are like rock musicians hanging out, acting stupid, and more importantly, filming themselves with, some sort of video recorder. And that was happening more and more. Today we live in a time where everything is filmed. But in the 90s, not everything was filmed because these were clunky machines. They were about this big and you'd carry them or whatever. They were just not practical for the way a little phone is just like sneaky shot here or something like that. Now, am I trying to make a comment on the 90s? Of course I am. Why? What kind of comment am I making? That things have changed? Well, things changed radically with the hippies, which is part of the point. Also, I want to say that things in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s were nothing at all like the way life had become in America and Western Europe by the 1990s. That is to say, something so radical had happened that it had never happened before in history like this. Now, let me go back for a moment to the 50s. I can hear someone saying, yeah, burned, but there were probably weird things happening in certain places in the 1950s. Yeah, there were juvenile delinquents, and there was people smoking dope, and there was people even shooting up heroin and such. There was weird stuff. But still, what you're looking at is radically different. For instance, in that image, okay, for one thing, you have these people just hanging around doing what? Just hang and listen to the music they're listening to. It's just a wall of noise. That wall of noise is going to become one of the main themes tonight. But more importantly, look at the relationships. Is there any sense of manners left whatsoever within that? But let's go back just for a moment to the beatniks of the 1950s. Now, one of the things that's really curious is there isn't much in the way of home movies from the Beat generation. Why? Well, they all had to have their little 16, well, more likely an 8mm camera. These things took a while to develop. There are a few clips here and there. But what you find, for instance, here's a little shot from a film called Greenwich Village. I think it was like 1961 or something like this. But this reflects the 1950s. People in a coffee shop. Now, this was actually shot in Greenwich Village, actually with people who were part of the Greenwich Village scene. But it's obviously also, a made-up feature film. Let's watch a clip or two here.
If you were really nice, you'd take us for a ride in the country sometime.
Crazy. You and Claudine whip up some chow on Saturday, we'll go dig the sun at Jones Beach.
You're on.
A new era has dawned, and I have a news item about a great new cultural shrine about to be erected. It's called Bible Land. And I had this dream about it. I will tell you of the dream, of the kaleidoscope of plastic religion, of the carnival midway to possible salvation announced by the voice. Promoter crooning in my ear, babbling in breathless excitement, and Bible Land.
Look how organized these people's clothing is. Look how, they talk. They're eloquent. Now, what they're saying and everything, I'm not discussing that. I've discussed a bit of that back in earlier episodes here. But what I want to point out, I'm going to show you one more clip from the past, what I want to point out to you is that there was a certain attitude which has completely vanished. And that attitude it's something to do with the manners of society, something to do with the etiquette, something to do with sincerity. But let's look at something else. Here's a clip of Joan Baez singing at Berkeley during the free speech movement. And what I'm not interested in the song she's singing, All My Trials, an interesting American song, but I'm interested in the audience. Look at this audience. Look at the faces as they sing along with her.
Little baby, don't you cry. You know your mama was born to die. Oh, my trials.
When I saw that for the first time, I think it was in the 80s, I saw that clip. I may have seen it earlier, but it didn't register. I was really it's just like a pang of sadness hit me. That sincerity had died. And that kind of sincerity. For instance, if you meet two people, maybe they're Christians, and they say, we love each other, and we're going to stay married till death do us part. are you surprised when like 5 years later they come to you and say, we're divorcing? No. Why? It's because who knows how to be sincere anymore? That's the weird thing. I think that's the nerve Jordan Peterson hit, is because Jordan Peterson, he has many faults and many, I have philosophical questions that I would ask of him, but one thing you can't deny is his sincerity, and I think that sincerity really touched people. But what we're about to do now is go through the fire that burnt out the last of the sincerity in Western culture, and that is the early 90s period. And let's get the elephant out of the room first. There is only one song. Unlike the 60s where there are many songs, you could say, I Want to Hold Your Hand, or Like a Rolling Stone, or Can't Get No Satisfaction, or Light My Fire, or, All You Need Is Love, or, an endless number of songs from the 60s, which could summarize parts of the decade. But there's only one song in the 1990s which can summarize the decade. So let's get that song out of the way and that group out of the way right now.
This song is called Smells Like Teen Spirit.
By the way, the first and last parts of the clip there were from the first ever performance of Smells Like Teen Spirit, including, obviously, there's little clips and such. This is the one I'm trying to see. I'm just doing an experiment to see if the algorithm is going to spit it out or not. And they may. If I avoid it, that's interesting for me if I ever need to use that technique again someday. But also, this song is big enough that if they spot it, they're going to be on it in seconds, because that song is still, I doubt there are many people watching this who don't know that song. So, if you're over the age of, right now, probably over the age of 50, you may not know that song. So, Nirvana, Kurt Cobain, lead singer. This was a super important moment. It was 1990. The album, for instance, Nevermind, knocked Michael Jackson off the charts. Not off, but out of the #1 slot, which says quite a bit about what was happening in the early 90s. There were a lot of groups. There were groups from Seattle like Pearl Jam and Mudhoney and Alice in Chains and Soundgarden. All of them were brought up like a grappling hook. Suddenly this grunge thing just seemed to appear from nowhere. Like I said, it isn't from nowhere. This stuff has been bubbling up all the way through the 80s. But there were loud and noisy women singing. There was all sorts of other music. It was kind of, shall we say, it was grunge, but it was also noise, and it was also alternative. And there were other scenes still going on as well, all the ones we discussed last week. But the interesting thing is there's no one name for this period yet. Eventually there will be. Eventually it'll, at the moment I'm just calling it the postmodern period, because that's one thing's for certain. Postmodernity has won out as far as culturally. Like I say, we're not talking the philosophy, but this ironic, self-referential, media-referential culture that cannot take anything seriously, that's postmodern culture in a nutshell. So here is Nirvana again. This is Kurt Cobain coming up to Sonic Youth after they've just performed. And I want you to watch this.
That was great.
Kim, you were amazing.
Kevin Costner.
You were amazing.
Kevin Costner. Hey, it's Kim, Steve, Thurston. Hey, it was great. It's a fabulous show tonight.
You guys were really neat.
Okay, if you don't know what he's doing, he's coming up and he's saying, "Ooh, that was neat." He is specifically referencing Kevin Costner in Madonna's autobiography, I don't know what to call it, called Truth or Dare. And let's watch a clip from that. That's from the early 90s.
You were great.
Thank
You were
you.
great. Thanks
Thanks.
for having us. That was
Oh,
really
sure.
generous.
Thanks for coming.
We thought it was neat.
Neat?
Really neat, yeah.
No one's ever described you quite that way. Hi.
Yeah,
Hi.
okay. Have fun tonight. I don't think we'll be making it a deal.
Oh, really? Not
Yeah.
neat enough for you?
Nah, well, not quite. We gotta put the kids. We gotta get with the kids.
Okay.
I'm gonna give them this.
All right. Hey,
God
thanks
bless.
for coming.
Thanks.
Neat? Anybody who says my show is neat has to go.
Now let's watch this again. Not only is Kurt Cobain doing Kevin Costner, but Kim Gordon from Sonic Youth is doing Madonna.
You guys were really neat.
And then all hell breaks loose. And I'm kind of going back to the beginning, where I just said these people are no longer the same people who lived in the 1950s. But nor are they the starry-eyed children of the summer of love of the 1960s. Nor are they the radicals. Nor are they the angry punks. They are instead in this other zone of complete absurdity. They can't take themselves seriously. They can't do interviews seriously. Guess what the grunge and noise music is? Well, it's the apocalyptic mode. And that's what we're going to see as we go on further and further. In fact, here is a clip from Nirvana. Just to make my point, Nirvana could do apocalyptic music, but the whole thing is this wall of sound and noise. By the way, my lecture I gave, which I have as one of the videos, called How Noise Entered Music, covers this pattern quite a bit. So we've arrived at this extraordinary moment where no one knows how to talk seriously anymore. Beck, pretty great performer from the 1990s, comes along and he's talking to Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth, who is in a sense one of the real spokesmen for this generation. But this is an interview on a small video channel. And listen to the conversation between them. And listen to learn something about Beck's music through this.
Welcome back to 120 Minutes. I'm Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth, your guest host tonight. And my first guest tonight is Beck. And this is Beck. So Beck, your song Loser, man, it's a smash hit. How do you feel about that?
It's like surfing in some oil spillage.
Yeah, it is like that.
Smashing.
Yeah, I understand. And your video Loser is pretty hot too. I see it everywhere. You must be really happy that people are like watching it and getting the Beck vibe.
Yeah, actually.
This is Beck, and stick around because Beck is going to be playing live for us later on. We're back here on 120 Minutes. I'm Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth, interviewing Beck, who's right here beside me. Beck, I sort of wanted to ask you some questions about, where you're from and who exactly you are, and I can't seem to get any straight answers out of anybody who seems to know you, but what exactly is your real name? Is it Beck? Were you christened Beck? All right. And another question I sort of wanted to ask you that I was really curious about, and I sort of toiled with this for quite a long time, is what exactly was the first record you ever bought?
Probably be a Hino record.
Hino?
Maybe it was Xanadu.
Xanadu?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I'm sure all of our viewers are very familiar with those, and they can relate to you on that.
Yeah.
Nirvana had a great influence on almost everything happening in music in the early 90s. And there were so many musicians who heard, particularly that album, Nevermind. It's like in New York City, as I walked around, I remember the weekend it came out, you could hear it everywhere. You go over to this one person's house, you'd hear it. You walk into Tower Records, you'd hear it. You'd be in a small indie store, you'd hear it. You'd hear it at another friend's house, you'd hear it just on someone's car. It was like everywhere. And one of the people who heard it was a singer who was in a group called the Blake Babies named Juliana Hatfield. And so she was evidently in a very dark place when she heard that song, and it brought her out of it. And I think it's interesting, if we go back to that song, it contains some very important lyrics that I think Kurt Cobain, I don't think he was trying to write the anthem of a generation at all. In fact, he often says he's just completely like, what are you doing? Don't talk to me. I don't have your answers for you. But those lines, here we are now, entertain us. I feel stupid and contagious. Those two lines in particular nailed it. Absolutely nailed the 90s. And in fact, all the way through, this is why that song is the crucial song of the 90s. I mean, people would say, yeah, but what about this big hit or what about that big hit? Yeah, but they didn't nail it. And that's what Smells Like Teen Spirit did. And so people heard that and they said, that's me. In 1999, the kids in Haines, Alaska, which is like, who knows where, were saying, that's me. Because this thing had drifted everywhere, but this culture of ironic despair had also drifted everywhere. And so this described the feeling perfectly. So when Juliana Hatfield hears it, she is touched somewhere deep in her soul, so much to the point where in the song, she says that she basically stopped thinking about suicide. That's a pretty big thing. That's a religious statement as well. That's a statement of meaning in a time where meaning is in real short supply. And by the way, this photo you're looking at here, this is, the reason I'm showing to you it is the backdrop is the independent record store I used to sell my used records out of. And I painted it red. It's just a little thing. Let's listen to the song. It's called Nirvana. And I've included the lyrics. And in fact, with some of the stuff, I've purposely included the lyrics because it's so noisy. You'll never hear it without it. But of course, all the artists know that the people are going to go home and pore over the album and listen to it over and over again, so they will eventually know the lyrics. But listen to the lyrics here and ask yourself, what do you think about them? Okay. Do you think she's actually calling out for Satan? No. This is the problem with this music, is that it is so ironic that people who are, for instance, 80s people, 80s Christians, who'd be listening to something like this would go like, oh my God, she's praying to Satan. Not realizing, did you not hear the part where she mentioned she wants to end it all? Did you not hear that? This is a statement of despair, reaching out for hope, finding I think what it is hearing that kind of heroic. One of the things about Smells Like Teen Spirit is it has this heroic quality to it. It's just the chord progression. I sometimes think Nirvana found one of the last great songs there. And I really mean that. That is to say, there aren't a lot of great songs coming up. There's slick songs, there's earworms, plenty coming in the future. But great songs, no, not in that sort of way. Certainly not in the rock mode. Well, you want to get ironic, you want to get crazy, you want to get noisy. You might remember last time we were listening to the charmingly named Butthole Surfers. I mean, I could do just a whole video on the names from this era. There are names that I just don't even want to say them. They're so bizarre. But even like we're coming up eventually, we'll hear a group called Hole. Well, what do you think that refers to? There was another one called Snatch. There's just, there's the Jesus Lizard? What was that about? But this is actually a techno, kind of gothic techno group, industrial group called Ministry. And Al Jorgensen is the main guy behind it. But he's got Gibby Haynes from the Butthole Surfers, who does this crazy stuff with his vocals. He's from Texas. And they're doing a song, and it's called Jesus Built My Hot Rod. Do you sense anything ironic at all in the title? You should. I've included lyrics. I've telescoped the song, so it's only about a minute long. It's really about a 4 or 5 minute song. And but I want you to listen to the lyrics, to follow along. And I want you to try to take them, I dare you to take them seriously. Now, does that mean if you can't take them seriously, does that mean this is a comedy album? No. This is absurdity. Because for these people, Jesus, Christianity, doesn't exist anymore except as a joke. Jesus built my hot rod. ministry with Gibby Haynes.
Soon I discovered that this rock thing was true. Jerry Lee Lewis was the devil. Jesus was an architect previous to his career as a prophet. All of a sudden, I found myself in love with the world, so there was only one thing that I could do, was ding-a-ding-dang, my dang-along-ling-long. My car. It's a love affair, mainly Jesus and my hot rod. Yeah.
Here's another sweet little song from the period, a little less absurd, a little more pointed. It's by Soundgarden. Notice the words, the parody of John 3:16 at the beginning. And I want you to follow the words and again ask yourself, for instance, how would anyone who's a Christian even deal with this? And my point is this. This is something serious. In a way, this song could be seen as a comment also on Jesus Christ Superstar. There's a lot connecting this to Jesus Christ Superstar. But it's also, let's watch it. at me like I need to be saved. Yeah. Because this whole generation is lost. And yet they felt extreme uneasiness with anyone from a Christian setting or a church setting or any sort of religious setting saying you're in trouble. Because it's like, well, yeah, but who cares? You see? Yeah, but shut up. You know? And it does mean that anyone who's coming from, I mean, what's happened in the churches by this time is you have mega churches and you have these the power of the gospel to do anything ministries. Are these people ever going to be able to communicate with these people? Especially since the music in the churches is so much more inferior and often imitations of this stuff, really bad imitations of this stuff. Soundgarden. Nirvana, they're both acts where that technically these are grunge bands, and grunge bands are essentially kind of 70s music mixed with a punk aesthetic with extra elements of noise and metal, kind of all mixed together. A lot of people call all the music from this period grunge, which isn't true. Sonic Youth is not grunge music, it's much more like noise. Well, this alternative and grunge stuff wasn't the only bad boy on the block. Bad child. Although people weren't so politically correct yet. So let's say bad boy. In fact, remember last episode I talked about Ice-T. Shows up, literally at one point Ice-T says, I was like John the Baptist. And NWA, niggas with attitude, is like the Messiah. Take it away, NWA. Straight out of Compton.
You are now about to witness the strength of street knowledge.
Straight out of Compton, crazy motherfucker named Ice Cube. From the gang called niggas with attitudes. When I'm called off, I got a sawed off. Squeeze the trigger and bodies are hauled off. You too, boy, if you fuck with me. The police are gonna have to come and get me off your ass. That's how I'm going out. For the punk motherfuckers that's showing out. Niggas want to mumble, they wanna rumble. Mix 'em and cook 'em in a pot like.
So one of the things that's happened, among many, is that the center of rap has shifted from New York City and the Bronx and has mutated in different places, but now the most important place is Los Angeles, particularly South Central Los Angeles, particularly places like Compton. And you'll notice some of the imagery in here, some of the language. It is intense. And straight out of Compton, guns, drugs, gangs, an irrepressible combination. There were movies around this time, New Jack City, Boys in the Hood, Juice, these other movies about gangs and drugs. It was a period in which suddenly this whole new aesthetic was emerging. So on one side you had all this noise and irony and aesthetic. On the other side you had this almost brutal kind of culture forming. Well, it wasn't just brutal for no reason. It was brutal because life on the streets of LA had mutated into this brutal sort of thing. One of the most menacing scenes in any movie that I've ever heard is in Boys in the Hood, and you have to watch. You can't see this scene on your little on your iPhone. You can't see this on a little computer. When you see it in the movie theater, just the sound of the Jeep beats. It's like shaking the whole streets. I'm sure you've probably heard some variation on this. But I know in New York City, I remember one time this thudding bass thing drove up to my apartment at about 4 a.m. And I literally was watching the bricks inside my house shake. That's how loud it was. And they were just in a Jeep. They were in a vehicle with huge speakers in the back, but the house was shaking. And I could not call the police because at that time, we weren't sure if the police weren't in on the drug take. So it was a dark time. One of the people, bands to come out of the scene, more Chicano than black, was Cypress Hill. let's watch a little bit of their song Insane in the Membrane.
Were you trying to get crazy with this, eh? Don't you know I'm loco?
I'm thinking it's all over when I go out drinking. Oh, making my mind slow. That's why I don't with the big 4-0, bro. I got to maintain, cause a like me is going insane. Insane in the membrane. Insane in the membrane.
You think I'm loco? There's something about this music. On one hand, there's a bit of a wicked sense of humor about it, but on the other hand, I'm not sure I'd like be wanting to drive down the street with these guys. You know, I mean, because we might get taken out. And but you know, it's like dope and guns and murder and violence. And part of it is, and Ice-T would make this point quite often, that we're not just singing. It is our lives, but we're not just singing to glorify it, but we are singing to explain it to people. Now, there is a fine line there between glorifying it and singing it. But before we get to Ice-T again, which we will, I want to point out, listen to a bit of this. This is Cypress Hill's song called, well, appropriately enough, Stoned Rangers. And we're listening to it right now. It's off the Temple of Boom album. And do you hear what they're sampling? They're sampling opera, which is genius. That's one of the things that happened during the early 90s, is the sampling starts becoming more and more creative. So people were sampling West Side Story orchestral arrangements. People were sampling, you know, Charlie Parker or Ornette Coleman. People were sampling all sorts of stuff. And there's too much rap to get into here. There was a whole jazzy rap scene going on then. And a lot of other stuff. It was a giant step scene, you know. But what I want to point out with this is rap was becoming huge. Almost all rap music by the end of the 20th century was being put out by huge labels. It was no longer these indie little 12 inches put out by, you know, Sugar Hill Records in Paterson, New Jersey or something like that. One more person who deserves a mention at this point is Snoop Doggy Dogg. And Snoop Dogg was... what's interesting about him is he's part of the gangsta scene, but he adds a kind of a very subtle element of humor, and his use of language and just his whole attitude is very different, which is one of the reasons why I believe he is so revered today. I think he is revered much more than anyone else in that scene, because he has this kind of it's kind of a twinkle in his eye, and a bit when he talks, he has like a, you know, say things like for shizzle, you know, it just like has this way. I don't want to imitate him right now. I could if I really thought about it, but he's really funny. Let's little the old dog off his first album.
Oh my God! Look at my yard. Man, look at this mess. Need to call a dog catcher or something. Man, what is? Look at that yard. Where's my daughter at? Is that dog in there? I want that dog out of my house.
That's my father. What we gonna do?
Don't even trip. I'm gonna handle this.
I want that dog out of my house. Dog, out! Get this dog off me! Out! Get this dog!
But what happens is, rap music goes on and on. Snoop Dogg becomes more important by the end of the 90s. But a strange thing happens. Gangsta rap stays popular, it seemed, forever. I mean, there were other kinds of rap that eventually took over, groups like Outkast, and and then there were the Kanye West and stuff, and that's in the next decade. And but Dr. Dre from NWA did this song with Snoop Dogg, and it's called Still D.R.E., Still Dr. Dre. And here's the thing about this. By this time, look at the video. The video is super slick. That's one thing. These rap performers have a lot of money and they can afford to get good photographers. But not only is it super slick, but look at the imagery. And after a while, rap songs became boobs and butts, cash, guns, cars jumping up and down, and some guy with swagger. And it became, and I think rap remained popular, influencing the children, the kids, but it lost that earlier edge that we just saw. And I just want to give you a little glimpse into the future here, because I'm not going to spend a lot more time on rap throughout the rest of this. There isn't a whole lot more to say, and for the reason that there isn't a whole lot more to say about rock music either. Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, are you still on the streets?
To perfect the beat, and I still got love for the streets. It's the D.I.Y. Since the last time you heard from me, I lost some friends. Well, hell, me and Snoop, we dipping again. Kept my ear to the streets, signed Eminem. He's triple platinum, doing 50 a week. Still, I stay close to the heat. And even when I was close to defeat, I rose to my feet. My life's like a soundtrack, I wrote to the beat. Street rap like Cali weed, I smoke till I'm sleep. Wake up in the AM, compose a beat. I bring the fire till you're soaking in your seat. It's not a fluke, it's been tried, I'm the truth. Since turn out the lights from the world-class wrecking crew, I'm still at it, after mathematics. In the home of drive-bys and acmatics. Swap meets, sticky green and bad traffic. I dip through, then I give you the D.I.Y.
I'm representing for the gangsters all across the world.
Still
hitting them corners and them lolos, girl.
Still taking my time to perfect the beat. And I still got love for the streets. It's the D.I.Y.
And all this talk about gangster rap and all the stuff happening in South Central LA brings us to one of the big defining events of the early 90s. And that was the Los Angeles riots, which have been renamed officially in our politically correct world as the Rodney King riots, just to give, now they all have a name. It's George Floyd or Jacob Blake or whatever. It's the LA riots, 1992. That's what they were called. I'm sticking with it. And it starts with Rodney King, poor guy who was just unfortunately, he was no saint. He was pulled over, and then this video accidentally caught what happened. And that was pretty brutal. I mean, that really makes anything we've seen of police brutality in the last year seem minor by comparison. Because it's not one guy and people saying what's going on. It's a whole gang of policemen. The police in Los Angeles at that time were pretty darn brutal, particularly to all those gangbangers. So, that's the spark. But it's not really the spark, it's the fuse being lit. The answer is going to be, or the spark is going to catch finally after the trial of the policemen who are tried over in Simi Valley, which is a place which is known for kind of being sympathetic to cops. And they get off. They're just doing their duty. Which, like I say, when watching that one, like how many cops on one guy beating him with a metal flashlight? Tough to justify in any means. And so Los Angeles erupted. And I'm going to show you some scenes now which are pretty violent. And I would argue that just the Los Angeles riot was as bad as the rioting has been in 2020. More people died in the Los Angeles riots in just a few days than the 30 plus people that have died in the rioting in the second half of since May of 2020. And you'll see it's a radically different kind of thing. This is just like an explosion of violence. There was more to it, though. There was protesting, but it didn't happen so much in Los Angeles as it did in other places, but I'll mention it in a moment. But prepare yourself. This is pretty brutal stuff. And we end with Rodney King, the victim himself, saying his famous saying, the most famous saying, the one I wished people would have remembered this year: can we all just get along?
We're also showing a live picture that they're seeing. They know what's going on down here.
I just want to say, can we all get along? Can we get along? Can we stop making it horrible for the older people and the kids?
Pretty crazy. I was in New York City at the time. I was living in a building in the Lower East Side in New York, and I had some black friends in the building. And they told me, don't go out on the streets today. They said the word is just don't go out. I did eventually kind of go out from a distance. I was with a friend. We were staying a little bit away from it, and we would see. Now, here's the thing. There were two separate groups of marchers protesting that day. One was the white, politically correct, Lower East Side, punk rockers, artists, whatever, on one side, and they were singing songs like "We ain't gonna, lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, ain't gonna make war no more." They were singing that. The other side had started in Times Square, breaking windows, and this is the first time I ever heard the ominous chant, "No justice, no peace." And I consider it an ominous chant because it is an absolute rejection of any sense of forgiveness. It is basically saying, we want justice. And what the chanters often seem to miss is the fact that when you hear those words, they can also be totally reversed. So, when there is no peace, there is no justice. You can't have peace. If everything's in chaos, there is no peace. And there can be no justice when there is no peace. The only way there can be peace is if people stop and listen and talk to each other. Period. Either that or one side totally wipes out the other, which is not a good way for things to be. So it was a tense time. Now, I remember I was walking through the East Village watching storefront windows. Fortunately, my friends who owned a record store, their windows didn't get shattered, but restaurants and other places had their windows shattered. This is... And I saw the No Justice, No Peace marchers over here. Then there was a huge police cordon keeping them away from, they ain't going to study war no more, kind of white liberal, or liberal probably isn't the right word, white scuzzy post-punk whatever guys over here at Tompkins Square Park. Keeping them apart because, in fact, if they had come together, it wouldn't have been a peaceful meeting. You see, because these people, no justice, no peace, means we don't want peace. We are going to study war some more. And these people would have probably tried at that point, they would have probably said, we have to stop the violence, which wasn't going to fly for these people. They just wanted to express rage, understandably. And yet it was a frightening moment. Not nearly as frightening as in New York City terms that 2020 has been in so many places around the country. But in this attitude, one song was discovered by a rap artist, which suddenly made everyone go like, oh my God, what is this song? This is the song we don't want anyone to hear. Now, it was by a rap artist, but it was not a rap song. Ice-T, he had a Warner Brothers contract, one of the biggest labels, had put out a kind of a heavy metal album with a group called Body Count. And he sang a song called Cop Killer. And you can just about imagine what happened when people heard this after witnessing what we just saw live on television from those helicopters and such. I mean, we saw those things live on television. By the way, what's interesting about today versus then was when you saw those guys getting pulled out of their trucks and beaten to death, that created sympathy for just normal people being caught in the middle of this. We saw no such thing in the mass media this year. That is to say, they simply, all of the major channels, with the exception of Fox News, all of the major channels basically always emphasized anytime the police did something wrong and did not show you any of those 30 people that died, except when it was to make a point for them. So, retired police chief David Dorn, who is black, gets murdered. Hardly a ripple is made. I mean, this is a guy respected and loved in his community, shot down. Hardly a ripple is made. Whereas, by seeing the violence then, that put the fear of God in people. Because people suddenly said, oh my God, we don't want this to go on. Whereas this year we had just the opposite. The media seemed to be doing all it could to pump up the violence by simply saying there was no violence, or it was mostly peaceful, or, it was just, what can we do? So, let us watch Ice-T talking. And I respect Ice-T. And I understand what he's talking about. He was, again, trying to explain. This was a work of fiction, but he did carry it over the line. And there was an interesting moment. Unfortunately, I don't have this recording with me here, but I do have a bootleg recording of Soundgarden doing Cop Killer, especially after it was banned. But Ice-T, please.
My homies, they come and they like, yo, I'm like, what's happening, player? They like, look, cops is out of control, man. We finna step to these police, man. Because they was whooping people. Rodney was just one. At that time, LAPD was snatching you out the car, cracking you in the head, So that was the vibe. And my boy said, yo, we need a cop killer.
Ice-T's song, Cop Killer, was released on a heavy metal album he'd made with a group called Body Count.
I got my black shirt on. I got my black gloves on. I got my ski mask on. This shit's been too long. I got my 12-gauge shot on. I got my headlight turned on. I'm out to bust some shots off. I'm out to dust some cops off.
It was a protest record against brutal police. It was the epitome of protest records. You know, Cop Killer is better you than me, Cop Killer, fuck police brutality. And I mean, you can't say it any better than that. Better you than me. If I'm gonna die, then I think you're gonna die. I'm not gonna just let you kill me in a brutal situation. That's what the record was about.
Oh, by the way, sorry if it's getting darker and darker as I'm doing this, but essentially the sun is going down, it's late in the afternoon, and I don't feel like waiting till tomorrow to get more light from the windows coming at me. So we will continue. Just to make the point about the weirdness of the 90s, there was another event right around the same time, and it was the fact that people started chasing down a Bronco, Ford Bronco, through the highways of L.A. to get one Orenthal James Simpson, O.J.Simpson, former football hero, friend of so many Hollywood elite, to get him for the murder of his wife, Nicole Simpson. And as we can see as we're following it, this was a national event. This went on for quite a while, where people were watching this chase live from helicopters in L.A. across the country. Eventually, there was one of those trials that occasionally gets called the trial of the century. I'm sure if you look at like the top 10 trials of the century, this is up in the top 3 probably. And most famously, Johnny Cochran, the lawyer, got O.J. Simpson off with the glove, and O.J. Simpson put it on. It was too tight, and Johnny Cochran said, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. And so O.J. Simpson walked, and everyone felt, not everyone, well, a lot of people felt he was guilty. Basically, if you were white, you kind of said like, yeah, I think he did it, because his wife was white. If you were black, good many black people cheered when O.J. Simpson got off. A clear sign, in a sense, it was kind of, and they basically justified it by saying, well, you let those policemen walk free. The division was there. But interestingly enough, this division did not stay at this kind of knife-edge division throughout the rest of the decade, or even into the next decade. Well, we had other things to worry about in the next decade. But essentially, it was a moment where things became, I don't know, rap music became more and more popular. You started seeing more black people in movies. You know, people like Denzel Washington were winning Academy Awards. It seemed like maybe we could put this stuff behind us, or at least cool off the jets. I mean, there were other events. The Korean greengrocers in New York City and black neighborhoods were despised by the people in ghettos like the Bedford-Stuyvesant ghetto in New York. Also, there were tensions between the Hasidic Jews and black folks. But essentially, the big thing didn't happen. It waited until 2020 to resume the tensions from the 1990s. So speaking about anger, there were some other people who were very angry at this time, and those people would be women. And their anger was coming out in music. Not only their anger, but their irony and their sense of stupidity and futility. Feminism had entered a very strange age, where Madonna doing things had now seemed like a certain kind of a feminist, who would be defended by people like Camille Paglia, who we'll hear from in a moment. But let's watch a bit of a group called L7. And L7, by the way, means an L and a 7 is the old word for being square. So they're basically saying we're squares, except they're saying you're square too. But anyway, let's watch this.
Her name is Colin, evil to see, 'cause she's back. She's back. She's back.
L7 are one of several all-girl post-punk acts to have emerged from America's West Coast. The bands are collectively known as Riot Girls, but L7 prefer comparisons to Motorhead and the Ramones, and I, for one, wouldn't argue. In England, you're known as very outrageous, particularly you, Danita, for your performance on The Word.
Well, there was a bum contest on there, you know? There's a bum contest, and I wanted to be a part, and they said I couldn't be a part in the bum contest. So I forced it down their limey throats. I'm just so psycho I'd do anything. Just challenge me.
And here's a moment where one of the singers goes as far as to get angry at the crowd, who are all loving their music, and throws a used wet tampon, out into the audience. These are no longer your women, again, go back to the beginning, to the 1950s. What would any grandmother during this period think of women like this? I mean, there's almost no category for this. These people never existed before with this level of cynicism and this level of, I don't know, in the past they would have said these people have no class. Now the very notion of having class is suspect. And so...
Somebody did challenge her at last year's Reading Festival.
All right, I got a little present for y'all.
Unfortunately for them, they picked the wrong time of the month.
Eat my used tampon, fuckers.
Another band kind of connected to this whole, call them angry women. They're not quite riot girls yet. Scene was the folks in Babes in Toyland. Listen to the way she's singing here. Again, no girls have ever sung like this. Finally, girls are singing with the amount of rage and intensity that Nick Cave and Johnny Rotten were singing. This isn't just shrieking. This is like insane, like howling. It's like, I mean, Susie and the Banshees was the name. But Susie was never a banshee like this. This is Kat Bellin from Babes in Toyland. And then probably the foremost of these really angry women singing, well, besides Diamanda Gallis and maybe some others, but the among the ones who became somewhat popular was Courtney Love from Hole, who eventually goes on to marry Kurt Cobain. And there's a whole bunch of stuff there with drugs and publicity and all the rest of it. It gets kind of nuts. But listen to this song. Listen to the lyrics. And here's the point. When she's singing When I Was a Teenage Whore, she's not joking. Many of these people in these bands by this time are living these really edgy lifestyles. There's a collusion between people working, for instance, in the dominatrix industry and people in some punk bands and whatnot. There is a sense of where it's all kind of getting mixed up. The morality is getting really hard to pin down because no one believes in morality anymore. Not in the old traditional sense. But there are some people inventing a new kind of morality out of this. And the next step on the line is what is called the Riot Girls. And among the groups that were most notorious coming out of Olympia, Washington, was Bikini Kill with Kathleen Hanna as the lead singer.
God, I'm so sure. What?
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, these girls used to mark themselves up with Sharpies and, write words on their bodies, which would later become a symbol of a certain kind of punk aesthetic. The Russian girls who were protesting did that sort of thing. But that was a real kind of this new sort of feminism that was, it's almost like infantile feminism, because it's these girls going like, for sure, it's like they're like Valley Girls or something, although they're coming from Washington. But what's interesting is that these people were completely against any sort of misogyny. So they hated groups like that with these strutting male figures like Soundgarden or Mudhoney, or all these bands had more of a machismo to it. They hated that. So this was their response to it. And they were borrowing more from punk than the grunge aesthetic. But what's interesting is that the way they're emphasizing things, and in fact, much of the way morality and life is discussed by bands from Nirvana through Bikini Kill and other bands like that, is exactly today's political correctness, minus some of the weird imagery. Some, but not all of the weird imagery. So, and minus the sense of, the interesting thing about this apocalyptic phase in rock music, and it really is an apocalyptic phase, is that it's not sincere, but it is genuinely confused. And what I mean by that is the confusion is real. They all know it. Here we are now, entertain us. We're just stupid kids. And the point is, they're stupid kids who, I don't know if any of these people ever grew up. There was an interview recently, a couple of years ago, with Kathleen Hanna, and someone wrote into the YouTube video, it's just like, why does she sound like a 13-year-old? Because growing up is not seen to be a virtue anymore. You see, those people in the 1950s and 60s, before the hippie era, they were trying to be adults. That was their goal in life, was to grow up. These people are not growing up. We've reached the stage of neoteny, where the tadpole still has the tail. Well, one person who was a very astute observer during this time was Camille Paglia, and her book Sexual Personae, which had been lounging around. She tried to sell it for, I believe, a decade before it actually sold, because no one wanted to buy it. She was kind of like the kind of woman who appreciated the Rolling Stones, which was like heresy to any other feminist. She considered herself a feminist. She was a lesbian. She was what would be called a pro-porn feminist versus all the anti-porn feminists from the 1980s. She carried herself with more swagger. She was much more in tune with these angry women, in a sense. And she was in tune with a lot of the machismo of the bands. And I'm going to let her explain herself here. She's being interviewed here by a couple of people. One is Lauren Hutton, who was a supermodel, one of the very first back in the 1970s.
Modernism has failed. That is, modernism has...
What was modernism?
The 20th century, there have been a number of major revolutions of thought in the last few hundred years. The Enlightenment, for example, opposed organized religion, but put science and reason in its place. Then Romanticism also opposed organized religion, but it put poetry and art in its place. Now in the 20th century, right, you have modernism knocking everything down, all ideals, religious, patriotic,
family.
Everything is gone. And so I, as a teacher now of almost 25 years, say that the children have nothing. The young have nothing. These are the latchkey kids of Generation X, right?
Orphans, I call them.
Yes, they're orphans. We have a whole generation of young people that lack the exuberance and the gusto that you and I have as part of our generation. We have a kind of brio, that they, a kind of joie de vivre that they lack.
So for her, she sees the problems of modernity. Camille Paglia also makes a point about men and women, and the point is this: there is a value to the traditional roles of men and women. And what she's saying here, this is like a hand grenade into the political correctness of the times, which was certainly there on the college campuses, but also it's still a hand grenade into the hyper-political correctness of the present.
To paraphrase you, I think you may have said it of Mozart, but it might as well be Michelangelo. There are no female Mozarts or Michelangelos for the same reason that there's no female Jack the Ripper.
Correct. I think that genius and criminality are both extremes and deviations off the end of the human spectrum, and this is my explanation for why there are no great women artists. Not that women have not been held back from practicing so many of the art forms, but rather that great art of the Picasso or Michelangelo kind comes from obsessiveness, comes from a kind of self-mutilation of relationship and so on. That's why we have very few women chess masters, very few obsessed serial murderers or computer hackers and so on. I think that the male brain has a greater capacity for both genius and criminality, but both are deviations.
Well, then how do you account for great female names in literature?
In literature, anything that has to do with psychology, women are extremely good at. And this would, as a matter of fact, even in music, places where there is room for the individual voice, for self-expression, there are great women vocalists, great women pianists, and so on, but not great women composers, interestingly, because composition seems to be very abstract, cold, almost mathematical. Women don't particularly like an inhuman world of a cold, almost astronomical kind of a world.
I feel that both genius and criminality of the Jack the Ripper kind are deviations off the ends of the spectrum. Women seem to chart in the great middle of the IQ continuum. And we know IQ is a very fluid concept, but I feel that that the reason there haven't been no major female artists in the visual arts in history is not simply due to women's lack of access to training. That is certainly true for some genres like sculpture, where women could not work as apprentices and had no access to expensive materials like bronze and so on. But let's take the example of musical composition or philosophy or mathematics. Women had access to pen and paper for hundreds of years now. An example of music, well-bred women of the middle and upper classes have had access to piano instruction. It was expected of women since the 1790s. It's now 200 years later. I speak as a professor of the history of the arts. It has to be remembered. In fact, even a composition teacher, a professional composer in my own university took me aside a number of years ago and said, why is it that my best women composing students drop out and just go off and get married, and far less talented men continue? And the reason is, I think, that women are not comfortable in an abstract world without emotion or psychology. That men, in fact, flee to computers or to math.
I disagree. I think it's something else entirely.
Yes.
I think it's that men's genitals are outside their bodies, and ours are inside our bodies. And because men's sexuality is on the outside, and we never think of ours, they have to come up with art to leave behind them, because we can come up with babies. And being much more complicated creatures, because we are, let's face it, we go through menstruation, menopause, all sorts of physical changes that men can't even imagine. I think that the big difference is that, and the greatness of men, is that they go too far. And when you say fan the flames of lust and get it up and keep it up, it's along that they go too far. That's their job. Their job is to build these bridges, to put us together. Their job is to put missiles up. We would never bother with that stuff. Our job is to make sure everybody's okay and warm and fed and clothed, and to keep men from going too far.
You may have noticed that Lauren Hutton, doing the interviews, as I mentioned before, she was a supermodel in the 1970s. But she certainly has a brain and is drilling Camille Paglia. Interestingly enough, her correction of Camille Paglia still would be considered super heretical today, because what she's saying is there are men and there are women. And that, for some reason, is like almost illegal to say today. I can say it, but for many people, like if you're, on a news broadcast for CBS News, and you go out on a limb and say that sort of thing, there are two genders, you will be crucified. It's just that simple. But this brings us to the subject of supermodels. Now, this may seem very radically, weirdly different from anything else I'm talking about here, but you'll see how it connects in a moment. It's odd, but interesting to me, that the very same moment that you had this ripped t-shirt, torn down, plaid-wearing, messy hair, grunge aesthetic is also, at the very same time, the heyday of the supermodel. The supermodel, as known in the 1990s, would not exist by the year 2000. There would be a few models left over, but back in the early 1990s, we all know the names of the top, 5 to 10 supermodels. Most people, if you said Christy, or if you said Cindy, or if you said Naomi, or if you said Linda, or if you said Claudia, or if you said Kate, people all knew who you were talking about. They were talking about the supermodels. The supermodels as a phenomenon was first recognized by Vogue magazine. You can see on this cover here in 1991. And these 5 models were considered supermodels. One of them, Tatiana Patitz, who is the one on top, would later kind of be demoted slightly as other models became more popular. But essentially, I saw her on the street once in New York doing a shoot. Pretty spectacular, and these models were treated in a very spectacular manner. We're going to watch a bit of material here on supermodels, and again, bear with me. I'm coming to a point where this all connects back to the point of what I'm doing here. Is I'm not trying to do all the phenomena. Someone would probably be saying, yeah, Bern, what about computers? What about, raves? What about all this stuff? Yeah, next time. The second half of the 90s, all this stuff becomes much more important. I'm trying to do, though, cover the stuff that directly pertains to how we got to where we are today. And supermodels are actually a very important thing in this discussion because of, let's watch a little bit. Let's discuss what supermodels are. We're going to look at different documentary material on the subject.
The supermodel syndrome has been one of the most talked about subjects on the international fashion circuit for the last 2 years. Time magazine even turned it into a cover story. Beauty, butts and brains are a big news combination.
They're all the big stars of the world today, and that is what they do with the clothes, the way they move and everything. But people today want to know about those girls like people wanted to know about movie stars.
Well, they've replaced movie stars in a way, have they not?
In a way they do, because movie stars, they talk too much. They're like me, they talk too much.
When I met Christy, she was on the cover of British Vogue when Anna Wintour just started, and she had her hair up, and she was wearing this white cross top, remember? And then I met her in my agency when I was 16 in my uniform.
She got discovered after school one day hanging out when she wasn't supposed to with her friends. And so a woman called Beth Bolt came up to her. And she was hanging out with all pretty blonde girls. And out of all the girls, I came up to Naomi and she said, would you like to be a model? And Naomi said, me?
What are the most stupid questions that people ask you on a day-to-day basis?
Do you think you're with her money? What's it like?
I think that's actually very rude to ask people about their money. I think that is really out of line, and, so what do you earn, basically?
To be honest, I think it's very indiscreet to be asking about how much money you earn.
They may be getting tired of hearing about it, but just about everybody else is talking about supermodels and the big bucks they make. According to Women's Wear Daily, an average rate the divas can command for a Paris runway go like this. Claudia Schiffer is at the top at $7,000, followed close behind by Linda Evangelista, Naomi Campbell, and Cindy Crawford at $6,000. Yasmin Gori, Helena Christensen, and Christy Turlington ring in at $5,000.
I can understand that people don't understand it necessarily, but I think that we definitely attribute to the sales of these clothes, and people are making billions of dollars off of us, and so a couple of $1,000s are satisfactory. There's not really any way to adjust completely to to this kind of life. I mean, it's okay because it moves really fast and you're with people and you laugh and you have a good time, but it's very, what's the word? you just sometimes want to just stay in one place for a very long time and never have to move and never have to see anyone.
They've got the experience of all the girls before them. You know, yeah, some of them are smart. Some of them are going to blow their minds on drugs and nightclubs and turn into pitiful, helpless wrecks. You know, there is nothing special about a supermodel. All it is a body and a face.
Still, the right face and body are utterly bankable. A supermodel can earn up to $2.5 million a year, and American Christy Turlington is doing even better than that. Her look cost plenty when it came to promoting Calvin Klein's Eternity, and now she's signed to Maybelline for a rumored $6 million. But her precious face hasn't gone to her head.
It's definitely an education. I think it's very innocent in comparison to the music or movie industry. Oh, definitely. Just from people that I know, I mean, just the people that I see, it's similar, but it's a step down. So, I don't know, it's a funny thing too. I mean, fashion is quite a ridiculous thing in the realm of the whole, you know, the whole picture, but, I don't know, people take it very seriously, which I find amusing.
Some of the models have emerged as stars, and among these runway stars, none shines brighter than 26-year-old Linda Evangelista. Linda lives here in Paris, and so we thought we'd take this opportunity to sample a day in her life.
So today's Chanel. On Wednesday is Hervé Léger. It's his first show, and he's the one I've decided to do this season for free. Each season I choose a young new designer to support. Allure, have Italian Vogue with Stephen Meisel. Every day I work, every single day.
I always wanted to be a model. I was obsessed with it. I mean, I read every fashion magazine from the time I was 12, but I never thought I would become this. Never.
The trinity of high-paid supermodels from the early 90s was Christy Turlington, who was pretty much the apex. That is to say, most people would tell you Christy Turlington was the model of the 1990s. And I can attest, she came into the store once where I worked, a small independent record store where I bought and sold used record collections. And I actually went up and helped her. But I can attest that when she walked into that room, it's like everyone got real silent. Everyone knew who she was. It's kind of like a goddess just walked into the room. She seemed perfectly humble, but at the same time, very much everyone adjusted their behavior because one of the most beautiful women in the world, if not maybe the pinnacle of that moment, just walked into the room. Also Naomi Campbell, who is the black British model, and Linda Evangelista from Canada. And Linda Evangelista was the model quoted as saying, we don't get out of bed for less than $10,000 a day. And we heard earlier in the documentary material how much they would make. Those $1,000 statistics a day, that was just for one day, couple hours on a runway. You get $7,000. And you just start multiplying that. And the contracts these women got for, companies like Revlon or Maybelline or whatever, huge. I mean, we're talking, just a massive amounts of money. And Linda Evangelista is an interesting case because she is considered to be she's considered to be the model's model because she was just like, she really loved modeling. Whereas Christy Turlington, if you saw from those interviews, she had some questions like, what am I really doing, kind of things. Whereas Linda Evangelista always wanted to be a model, always saw herself as a model, and took it too seriously. At the same time, she was known for being quite arrogant. I mean, that phrase, don't get out of bed for less than $10,000 a day. That's kind of arrogance. And at the same time, it was supposed to be a joke, but, that's a joke you just tell with your model friends. It's not the kind of joke your average girl is going to go like, oh. Except they were looked up to. Now, what's interesting is by the end of the decade, what happened was that, a couple of things happened. They were, by the end of the decade,
you're all in my lights.
These models were being replaced on the covers of magazines by movie stars. And that was very much, some people say it was a conspiracy to get rid of these fabulously famous women who did nothing but pose. But another thing that happened was a different kind of model showed up, also around the same time. And that was Kate Moss. Kate Moss was, they consider her small. I mean, she was like 5'8" or something like that. That's not small for a woman. But they considered her small, but she looked very different. Eventually, they would talk about these waif models who were very thin and such, whereas these other models, the truth is they were thin too, but they had more of a sense of presence and glamour to them. Well, let's watch a little bit of material on Kate Moss.
When she was 16, photographer Corinne Day shot black and white photos of her for the Face magazine styled by Melanie Ward. The shoot was titled The Third Summer of Love, and successfully represented her as the natural earthy beauty she would go on to be. Although captivating, silent, and confident in the photos, Kate recalls having a nervous breakdown. She cried in the bathroom and was extremely uncomfortable because at the time she was so young and felt so unlike herself that she couldn't get out of bed for 2 weeks. Yes, in Kate's industry, nudity at just 16 was the norm. Different times. Her next big venture was a very successful Levi's campaign called Levi's for Girls, also shot by Corinne Day. Her next shoot for the Face by Tony Briggs would increase her profile in the modeling world. It was titled Haute Coiffure, and would place her adjacently as the anti-supermodel in comparison to models like Naomi Campbell and Cindy Crawford. However, it wasn't until 1992, with Kate Moss's Calvin Klein ad with Mark Wahlberg, that she would become an international icon.
Shouts goes out to my man Calvin Klein, good looking out for the drawers. Not saying I would do another Fruit of the Loom commercial or nothing like that, because they don't make the hype shorts. These are the 90s, man. They just fit good and they hold me snug. So if I'm about to go get some skins, I'm not going to put on like no silk underwear. Oh, she got freckles. Next question. No, the best protection against AIDS is to keep your Calvins on. Now that could definitely come between me and my Calvins. Do you have Calvin Klein underwear on?
She also struck a chord in the industry with her haunting Calvin Klein obsession ad in 1993, photographed by then-boyfriend Mario Sorrenti at just 18. Her piercing eyes, raw bare face, and slicked-back wet hair caused an obsession with Moss that far outweighed the name of the fragrance.
When she was totally wet and her hair was all back and all you could see was the shape of her skull and her cheekbones and her eyes, it was like looking at this incredible primitive beauty. I mean, we were super young. We were just doing what made us happy. When I would photograph her, it was just part of hanging out in a way. And that was fun. We really enjoyed that, you know?
How prepared is anyone at 17 to become a public figure? How ready was Kate Moss when Calvin Klein made her an icon overnight?
The 80s were over, and the 90s, to me, represented something different, something more natural, something less flashy. And Patrick Dumarchier, knowing what I was looking for in print, said this young thing just walked into his studio, took some pictures, and he knew that this is what I wanted.
For like 2 years, I did like go-sees and worked for no money. I was always borrowing money off my mum. She was beginning to get fed up with it and started telling me to get a job, proper job and stuff like that when I started to work, so. It's just as well I kind of stuck at it and didn't take her advice.
Christy Turlington was probably the top model from that period, but Kate Moss was probably the most iconic from that period. And I would say more people today probably recognize Kate Moss than they do Christy Turlington. That is, say, all these years on. What's another thing that was interesting, and this is just a subtle thing, was back in the early 80s, and in fact, even up through the mid to late 80s, there was a really trashy aesthetic, a garbled, junky aesthetic that showed up on the front of fashion magazines. But by 1990 or so, there was a new aesthetic going back to the 1940s where it was almost, and you can really see this with the Harper's Bazaar covers, there's a real sense where they've cleaned it up, and they look beautiful again. And to me, that's, you can think what you want about supermodels, but this aesthetic to me is far more beautiful, and therefore it's a good thing that it's like that. It doesn't take long, though, till the end of the 1990s, where the junkie aesthetic starts to make its way back. And by the early decades of the 21st century, the junk is back. And that is to say, you look at this cover, that's like a later period, Drew Barrymore, and it's just all this stuff coming at you. And it's because they no longer trust people. Only for a few years did they trust people enough to buy the magazine on the basis of the fact that there was such a thing as beauty and glamour. Now they no longer trust that. They only trust that one of these words here may hit you and you may buy it. And so that, to me, is a very interesting trend. Here's a Vogue cover featuring Linda Evangelista from about 1991. Do you notice what I notice about this cover? Here's what I notice about this cover. She's wearing a tattoo. And I would like to say wearing it. That is to say, it's actually not a permanent tattoo. No supermodel from the 1990s is going to go out and get something to deface their skin like a tattoo. They might get something hidden somewhere on the body, but not like that. But this is the first cover to show a fashion model wearing a tattoo. Why did this happen? Again, we're in the 1990s. In 1989, a book came out on the research book. It was kind of like a book magazine series that came out. And this one was called Modern Primitives. And it featured scarification, tattooing, piercing, things like this. And I remember bringing this book. I bought it because, again, I'm always tracking things down, trying to say, where'd this come from? So I bought this book, and on the day I bought it, I was going to a friend's party with all, 20-somethings, young 20-somethings at a party in New York City. Now, you'd think these people would be super hip. But no, they're college students. College students are rarely hip. Not like the underground people in New York. They weren't the people. These were college students. That's all I can say. They were like New York University. And I brought this. I started to show it to my friend, and pretty soon everyone was looking at this book, and people were absolutely horrified by all of it, especially the piercing, but also and the scarification, but also the tattoos. Just horrified them. These large, huge body tattoos and stuff. And but I knew better. I'd actually picked up a magazine in about 1985 or so. It was a tattoo magazine, and it said, it said the new primitivism. New tribalism is what it said. And I thought to myself, new tribalism, tribes. Yeah, this stuff is going to happen soon. And it did. It was already starting to percolate in the real underground scene, in the S&M scene, in the, grungy, noisy scene. But suddenly, when I showed it to these people, they all said, no way, we're not doing this. And everyone said that. I mean, there was like about 20 people there, and they were all gawking at this book. And they all said this. And I said to them, yeah, in about 5 years, most of you will have tattoos. Some of you will have strange piercings. They looked at me like I was insane. I am sure if I went to those people today, I would find tattoos. Because I just immediately said to myself, that's where we're going. This has to be. Because tattoos are a symbol, particularly tattoos, but the rest of it too, is all a symbol of tribal identity. Also, I eventually met the people who wrote these books. They came over to interview me for as a subject once. And when I was listening to them talk, basically the main guy, Vale, said to me, anything we can do to get rid of Christianity, we will. And they looked at tattoos as being a perfect way, all this body modification stuff as being a perfect way to lessen and eliminate the effect of Christianity. And so we arrived at a period of extremes. Now, I've already talked about the music, I've talked about the anger, I've talked about rap music, gangsta rap, but not only is the music and everything extreme, but people are starting now to change their appearances. So if you were to show up in New York in 1990, very few people, relatively speaking, had tattoos. If you were there in 1995, you'd look around, and I remember in 1995 going into a Rizzoli bookstore, one of the classiest bookstores in New York City, and there's a girl behind the counter with a bull ring in her nose, and it just looks so quotidian. So, just like, this doesn't mean anything, because she's wearing a nice, maybe I don't know what she does when she's not here, but here it just looks like jewelry. So, yeah, but I knew it was, eventually this stuff would go around the world. I remember there was a girl when I finally moved to Alaska in 1997 who came to me with a tongue piercing, which is a really stupid thing to do, but she showed it to me. She was all proud of it, thinking I'm from New York City, and I'd be like, wow. And I just basically, I think it was 1998, I said to her, she was like 17 years old, I said, yeah, how 1990 of you? because to me, there was actually a comic that came out during that time where there are two old people, totally tattooed and pierced, sitting in some sort of convalescent rest home or something, in their, they're in their 90s or something, and one looks at the other and goes, you were in the 90s too, huh? So it became a trend, which has not stopped, because wherever you go, I think people are so desperate for identity. It's like you give yourself an identity. It's a tribal identity. Well, among the people who entered this realm of new extremes, including the sexual extremes, was Madonna, who starts doing this weird stuff. She's become essentially the biggest star on the planet by this point, except for Michael Jackson. But Michael Jackson doesn't really, no one wants to dress like Michael Jackson. But Madonna comes out, and puts out this book called simply Sex. And in the book, there's lots of erotic photos of her and other people, and it's like, gay, bi, queer, whatever, LGBTQ, whatever. All of it is going on in here, and Madonna is taking part in all of it. And some of it is frankly pornographic. Others of it is what we would call erotic, which is, I guess, more artistic, but not quite as pornographic. But that is a mainstream sign. I mean, Madonna is mainstream. I often say Madonna never sold out because she never bought in. So what Madonna is doing here is she is looking at all that stuff in the 80s, all that stuff I talked about last time, and she is now incorporating it into, she wants a little bit more edge for her material. So we've arrived at a place of new extremes. Interestingly enough, many people think basically Madonna killed her career with this book. I mean, she went on, she did a lot more stuff, but she was never as important again after that book. The book basically said to people, okay, she's over. And, she kept making money and doing concerts and getting cosmetic surgery, because what's the difference between cosmetic surgery and piercing? Please tell me. But meanwhile, back in the underground, extreme knowledge was becoming a thing. So you have these research books, and the research people started off making these basically really homemade tabloid zines, which I'll discuss more about in a minute. But then they started putting them out more in book form. Here's one with William S. Burroughs. You might remember I said there were 3 beats who were the most important of the beats. And Jack Kerouac was the beat of the Beats. He was the first. Then Allen Ginsberg was the hippies beat. He was the one with all the cosmic consciousness and all of this. But William S. Burroughs was the underground 80s and the 90s beat before his death near the end of the decade. And this guy was just as cosmic and weird, but in a science fiction heroine sort of mode. And he's actually, I've listened to lots of William Burroughs. I'm trying to do his voice. I don't want to attempt it right now. But if I get into a moment, it's just like, he's got one point where he's talking about our simian ancestors, and he goes like, and our simian ancestors, right? He's talking like dinosaurs or whatever. But he had this certain almost Carnival Barker quality, really seedy, but he came across as being very intelligent as well. Everyone in the underground was reading Burroughs. And David Cronenberg eventually made a movie of Naked Lunch, which is a bizarre movie, which if you're in the mood for bizarre movies, you might want to watch, but don't do so right after eating. They also did a book on the whole industrial culture. This was not just on industrial music, but lots of other stuff. Their book on pranks is radical. Now, this isn't just a book of jokes. This is a book of really radical kinds of pranks. And the whole point is the prank is to change people's reality. And again, the whole point of this company is to spade up that old Western civilization, the old Christianity, the old humanism, and bury it. That is really what I was told. That's also what's written in the front of some of the books. And pranks, Joe Coleman did a prank once where he dressed up to a high school reunion as someone who had actually died. And he came there as this person. People had thought he died, but there he was. He looked enough like this person. And it was a random high school reunion. But he came and he had strapped to his body a piece of metal. And on top of the piece of metal, he was wearing a big coat, was all these fireworks. And at a certain point, he lights the fireworks in the middle of the reunion dance or something. What does that mean? I mean, it's funny when you think about it, and then it's like he's totally altering the reality of these people. Again, they did books on very strange films. Very strange films does not mean anything in the Marvel universe. It means weird films that people made. Another word used during this time was psychotronic films. I'll let you look that up. Also, incredibly weird music. They did a couple. They actually interviewed me for the second one, but my problem is I'm not a geek. I don't come off as like someone... I'm not at all a person... It's like when you come to my house, you don't go like, oh my God, he's dedicated himself to, lounge music from India. It's I don't have one focus. I'm focused on everything. So they were really impressed with my record collection. It's big. But they were not... I don't think they were impressed by the fact that I was kind of talking about this stuff pretty intelligently and not obsessively. I am not an obsessive. I am interested in meaning. And I know there's always meaning there. So I didn't get into the book. Not obsessive enough. Sorry. So then there's the Amok Press, the Amok Books. Two separate organizations but related to each other. Two brothers started them, along with a guy named Adam Parfrey. And what they did was they put out these books that were radical. Even radical, and I don't mean politically radical, I mean culturally radical. They put out, let me list some of the books they put out. And actually, let me mention Feral House as well. Feral, F-E-R-A-L, as in wild. So they put out books like The Apocalypse Culture and Apocalypse Culture 2. These books are radical interpretations, reinterpretations of things. They are looking for knowledge which is essentially forbidden. They put out the Manson file on Charles Manson. They put out Cult Rapture, another book about cults, and just all sorts of essays about very weird, strange cults. They put out the Amok Fifth Dispatch, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and also the Amok Sense-Around edition, the Amok Journal Sense-Around edition. And they also put out the book Panzram, which is the book Jordan Peterson often quotes, the journals of this murderer. And it's just, crazy stuff. The Fifth Dispatch there was actually a fourth dispatch of this catalog. What the Amok catalogs were called was dispatches. So there was actually a bookstore, which I once went to in Los Angeles, called the Amok Bookstore. And you could go in there and get, the Unabomber Manifesto. You could get, they were the kind of people who would deal with stuff like the Church of Satan or Charles Manson or the Process Church of the Final Judgment or Psychic TV and the Temple of Psychic Youth or Aleister Crowley. Or they made tons of book on conspiracy theories, all sorts of weird ones. Apocalyptic industrial culture, anarchist and CIA instruction manuals. Georges Bataille, the famous French surrealist philosopher who believed in this very edgy, transgressive idea about what transgression actually does to us. These people are percolating under all of this. Of course, Nietzsche is a very important source for these people. It's the first place I read about cargo cults in the Amok Journal. And of course, everything related to sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and especially sex, and especially drugs. So, eventually this stuff would all be shot like I wouldn't say a vaccine, like a virus into the bloodstream of the internet. And this stuff is all still out there, but now it's just... So, the first manifestations of this sort of stuff was things like X-Files. This stuff shows up in 4chan, in Reddit. It shows up all over the place in very strange websites dedicated to the extremes of knowledge and extreme irony and such. All of this kind of gets its start here with these books and these companies, particularly Amok Press and Books and Feral House and Re/Search. To explain the Fifth Dispatch catalog, this was a fantastically original way of categorizing knowledge through a book catalog. And because the book catalog is huge. It's about, an inch thick, the Fifth Dispatch. It has just all sorts of weird categories. So Sense-Around would be a category. They had one, the parallax view, which would be conspiracy theories, because parallax vision is two slightly different views of the same things. They had one for recreation, but they would deal with everything from, those who shall not be named who molest children to, NAMBLA and all that. They would just deal with all of this stuff. Because they didn't, Tom of Finland, they actually had Jacques Ellul's propaganda book in there, which I was kind of proud of. And they had a section for Nietzsche and another section for Bataille. These were like the two main gods over all of this stuff, was Nietzsche and Bataille. We had reached a kind of extreme culture which was spreading in all sorts of ways throughout. In New York City, one of the extremities was through performance art. And performance art had been going back into the 1950s and 60s, but then in the 1970s, there were people like, I think it was Chris Burden was an artist who had himself shot with a .22 caliber pistol or rifle or something for his art. But by the 1980s, you had people like Karen Finley, who's doing strange things with yams and pouring beans all over herself. I actually saw her do that. And getting in trouble because she was being funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. And then people realized, really? You're funding this person shoving yams in all sorts of unholy places? Why? But it was extremely politically correct by today's standards. That's what's interesting, is so much of the stuff, you look at what they were actually saying, and they are creating the world we live in today from one perspective. They're only doing one. Interestingly enough, I think the people from the extreme knowledge perspective are more on what we might call the right. It's really weird, because they're into extreme free speech, whereas people like Karen Finley are into extreme victimhood culture. In fact, many of these people are essentially saying, they're essentially people who have been abused by their parents and their society, and it's almost like you have to have been abused by your parents or somebody to be a performance artist and to get any respect, whether it's Lydia Lunch or Joe Coleman or Karen Finley or Diamanda Gallas. All these people had to have gone through some sort of trial by fire to be considered, in a sense, the new prophets of the new age. Joe Coleman is really fascinating. He's around the same age I am, and he used to do these shows where he would be dressed like an old-time carnival barker or something like this. This is one of his performances where he explodes himself with fireworks. He was also an artist, so he took, say, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, which we watched a bit of last week, whenever number 8 was, and then he draws this. He draws all sorts of things. Here's one of his album covers, self-portrait of him. Very interesting album. The album also includes the audio recording of him biting the heads off of a couple of mice as part of his geek performance. By the way, geek really means a carnival performer who bites the heads off chickens and things like that. This is really fascinating. This is a painting he made in the 1990s, obviously after the Los Angeles riots, after the Gulf War. And you know what's weird about this painting? It kind of looks like a prophecy of 2020. Give it a look. And this photo from one of his performances is one of the most stark performance photos I've ever seen. There's a dead goat hanging from the ceiling in a Boston, some sort of performance warehouse, and the firemen are looking up at it and going like, "Hey Charlie, what is this?" This is Joe Coleman. It's hard to put these kind of people into any framework that makes sense in today's world, because they are physically doing things that are over the edge. I, in fact, had some friends in a group. My friends Kembra Fowler and Samoa Moriki had a band, and they still play every now and then. The Voluptuous Horror of Karen Black. Karen Black is not such a great actress, but she was in films like 5 Easy Pieces, and she was also in various other films that are worth noting. But she's a cross between kind of a punk grunge aesthetic on one hand, and on the other hand, she's influenced by the Viennese or Austrian actionists, who include people like Hermann Nietzsche, who he used to do what Joe Coleman did, kill animals for her performances, or used menstrual pads and stuff. And I'm not going to show you all of any of a performance of hers, and what you're seeing may seem extreme to you, but I mean, she used to do things like crack eggs filled with paint over her derriere while being turned upside down, and the derriere was not covered. And this was a strange sort of thing. Let me give you a little explanation. By the way, they're also going to sing a song called "Going to Alaska," but I'll tell you a little bit about that when we're done with this.
This is Al Golsey from Midnight Blue. I usually interview strange people. Here I have three, I think three strange people, in that they're women in music and who have a background in the sex business. You are, I always have trouble with your name, Kimbra Fala. Why the outfit?
Well, this is my costume that I wear in my rock band, The Voluptuous Horror of Karen Black.
But it's a costume. I mean, on a date you would not appear in this outfit. Your husband would not expect you to go to bed tonight in this outfit.
Well, I have gone to bed looking like this.
Absolutely sick. There's so much dust all over the glass in here. So much dust that I can't even see myself. What I think we should do every day, perhaps once a week, is a cockroach and where we cover the houses. I just get so fed up walking into people's homes and seeing all that film. I just don't even talk about it anymore.
Our music, if we were to rate it, it's definitely PG-13. You know, we have semi-nudity on stage, and it's for all audiences, really. We have all different types of people coming to our shows.
I mean, is there a connection between the music and your pussy?
Oh yeah, definitely. You know, if I could sing out of my pussy, I would.
I would love that.
And I think it's a definite sexual buzz being on stage. The adrenaline starts going, the lights, the smoke. It's very exciting.
I like that song, Going to Alaska. It was just a kind of a catchy little weird song. And the lyrics all come from Karen Black's role. Not all, but mostly come from Karen Black's role in 5 Easy Pieces, which is a very strange, again, irony. What does this mean? Is this a piece of despair? I mean, what's going on here? One of the things I think is fascinating, we're going to see this more in just a second, is that they're trying to find a way, I explained it as they're trying to find a way to celebrate things. Kimbra was also connected to the underground film community in New York City, which was also known as the Cinema of Transgression. People like Nick Zed, Richard Kern, Kimbra, and others were a part of this movement. Basically, what you do is you make a film for however little money you can, and you just try to do something with it. We're going to watch a little bit from a film by a guy named Nick Zed, and this film is called Geek Maggot Bingo. And the geek here does not reference guys who are like nerdy. Richard Kern was probably the most important of these filmmakers. And one of the things that I thought was really fascinating in that Geek Maggot Bingo is, at no point, it's weird. That's the thing about this stuff. Whether it's Kembra and Samoa's performance in The Voluptuous Heart of Karen Black, or Nick Zed's film here, or what we're about to see with Richard Kern, which is a little more extreme. But the thing is, it's weird, and at no point do you say to yourself, oh, this is realistic. Yeah, at no point are you saying, for instance, if you're watching The Voluptuous Horror of Karen Black, are you ever saying to yourself, oh, this is a really sincere band? No, because that's not the point. Although, if you ask Kembra, I'm sure she would look at you in a deadpan sort of way and go like, of course we're sincere, because that's Kembra. But the thing is, there is this element of irony and an element of hopelessness and an element, I look at it like this, it's a culture which has lost all the other parts of its culture. They really can't access the past anymore. So what it is they're reinventing culture like kids in a kindergarten. Someone tells them, build a building. And so you give them clay and they build a building. And that, in fact, Kembra's philosophy, she called it availableism. Whatever is available, you use it. And I actually learned a lot from that. I started making my own films when I left New York, because I didn't want to make them in this setting. But I used the same lessons as saying, why not? And in fact, when I eventually got to puppetry, I immediately recognized a kindred connection between the thing that is completely fake and yet somehow touches you in a weird sort of way. But there is also the existentialist emptiness of so much of what's going on here, as you'll find out with Richard Kern.
I don't know. What's the next question?
You do a love-suicide series about love affairs and suicides involving this. And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, that's a series, Super 8 series. Everybody that falls in love and it kills themselves.
Can you tell us a little bit more about it? What do you mean?
Yeah, it has Bill Rice in it. He's really great. David Wojna Horowitz, Tommy Turner, and Nick Zed's in it. A lot of people that live around here, and has a lot of violence in it. No, she's not in that. A lot of violence, a lot of sex, and everybody dies in the end.
Do you purposefully work with violence and blood for a shock technique to get your message across fast?
There's no message. It's just pure entertainment.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So what we're about to see, keep in mind, is just made for entertainment. This is a performer who went by the name of Lung Leg. Lung is in the thing that pumps you, leg. Don't ask. And this is also Lung Leg. Both of these are from Richard Kern movies that are entitled Submit to Me. And this is also Lung Leg. And this is such a disturbing thing. Now, if you say to yourself, oh, it's just a girl with some makeup putting it on her face, how disturbing could that be? Well, she turns it into an act of almost psychosis on the screen. And again, there is this sense of damaged people. And that the more damage you have, the more you become valuable for your damage. Let's watch this, and this will also go into couple of other quick disturbing vignettes from one of Richard Kern's Submit to Me videos. So that was pretty weird stuff. And believe me, there was a lot of weird stuff. Sometimes these films would be nothing more than someone throwing up or someone shooting themselves up with heroin or something like that. Anything that, it was like people trying to feel something who could no longer feel. But as I pointed out, there was an aspect of this that it was very much a D.I.Y. kind of concept. And the D.I.Y. concept is probably, to me, the most important aspect of punk and all of this aesthetic. And in a way, this was the last period for it. Here are some images of a store that sold nothing but zines in New York City. It was called See Here. It was in the East Village. And this is the hip of the hip. That is to say, you get your little, you'd print up something. Some of these look more professional, but you'd have these things printed up on a Xerox machine or whatever, photocopier. And then you would sell it. And it could be on anything, your favorite type of music, your favorite kind of movies. I knew one guy who did it on just weird food that he liked or weird products. D.I.Y. The comic books also were in this D.I.Y. category. There was people like Julie Doucette, who was a friend of mine briefly, and she was doing a piece up in Montreal called Dirty Plot. And again, it just shows her cutting herself. It shows her having like hallucinations, shows her in dreams on acid trips. It also shows her in daily mundane life. Or another guy named Joe Matt, who would show himself, again, just all his fears and foibles. I mentioned a bit of people like Harvey Pekar and others last time. But again, it was all DIY. Many of these things just started as Julie Doucette started as a mini-zine. It was a period where it was the last period where you could just make some object and give it to people. Like, here's Thurston Moore, and he talks about the value of the object. And a lot of people miss this about the 90s. There was a value to the thing itself, a value to, in the world I lived in, everyone made vinyl records. This was in the 1990s, but everyone had their vinyl still. These people weren't giving up on it because it was a real thing, a real work of art. They were, which is one of the reasons why vinyl still hangs around today. CDs are kind of fading, but vinyl is still there in the midst of everyone streaming stuff. But the point is, as Thurston Moore says, the material thing emanates.
Cassettes and CDRs, it's like there was really just, people were just really doing it. Making actual physical, things, as opposed to like what it's become now, where it's just like, put your shit up on SoundCloud, keep doing it. That's fine, it's great, it's an open library, it's a utopia, that's what we've been working for, here it is. But make that book, make that cassette, make that record, what kind of coin you have, it's just like, you can make something. You don't have to do that, but I mean, if you really want to know like what my advice is, give things to people that way. Maybe they'll put it on the table, but at least it'll be there. I mean, it's just this thing, it emanates.
Here's Kurt Cobain and Dave Grohl talking about life in the most famous rock band of the moment.
I really don't care what anyone thinks about my past drug use. I can put the blame on that kind of influence, but it's a mixture of, rock and roll in general, the Keith Richards thing and Iggy Pop and all those other people that did drugs. I just thought it was just one of those things that you do, to relieve the pain. But, as I expected, before I started doing heroin, I realized that I knew at the beginning that it would become just as boring as marijuana does, Like all drugs, after a few months, it's just as boring as, breathing air, So I just don't want to try. I've always lied about it because I didn't want to influence anybody, I didn't want anyone to even consider the thought of doing drugs because it's really stupid. Nothing more embarrassing than a group of people walking up to you and shaking and clamoring and praising you like you're some kind of fucking god or something. It's embarrassing.
People are always telling you, you're so great, you're so good, your band is so great, you changed rock and roll. And you just sort of think, no, I didn't, nothing's changed really. And I'm not great, I don't understand why everybody's so enamored by the band. There's so many bands in Seattle now. Seattle is the new Los Angeles, And that's kind of upsetting because Seattle was a city that, it was a clean city and it was a small city and there was no traffic and there was no air pollution. And it was something really great that a lot of people were attracted to. So they moved there. And, the more people that move to the city, the bigger and worse the city gets.
And so, what do? You're in these punk bands, you're in these hardcore bands, you're in these underground metal bands. You didn't expect any sort of fame. And then it comes to you. And what do? Well, for Kurt Cobain, it became too much. And so he eventually shot himself in the head with a shotgun. Here's some news reporting from that moment.
Julie, the music world and Washington residents hold their breath at this hour as the medical examiner continues his investigation.
Here's a closer look at the Cobain home at 171 Lake Washington. Police are on the scene conducting an investigation. Authorities believe the man inside died after he shot himself in the head with a shotgun. Officials say a suicide note was found near the body.
The electrician was going to do some repair work. He went up to above the garage where there's a small cottage above the garage, and when he looked inside he saw a man lying on the floor. It was obvious this man is dead from a shotgun wound to the head. Now there was a suicide note left inside the house, and he quickly left and called the police. Our officers had to break into the door because it was locked. It was obvious this person was dead.
How did you guys find out about this?
We've been hearing it on the radio all day about unconfirmed things.
Anything.
Something happened. They were really evasive on what was going on. We happened to just be up in the area. We knew he lived up in this area.
It was just chance. We were just
saw you
sightseeing.
guys. We figured one and put it together, and now we're here.
Fans brought flowers, notes, even candles. And like Erica Miller, they brought their grief.
His music meant so much. It touched so many people's hearts that it's really difficult. I mean, even though we don't even know him, it's really difficult.
The most personal account came from Cobain's widow, Courtney Love. She spoke to fans in a taped statement.
I'm really sorry, you guys. I don't know what I could have done. I wish I'd have been here. And I wish I had listened to other people. But I did.
And let's continue with Courtney Love reading Kurt Cobain's final note as he lay dead in his house. And the thing I want you to notice is that at a certain point she gets, well, just listen to it first.
Anyway, he left a note It's more like a letter to the fucking editor. I don't know what happened. I mean, it was gonna happen. But it could have happened when he was 40. He always said he was gonna outlive everybody and be 120. I'm not gonna read you all the note because it's none of the rest of your fucking business, but some of it is to you. I don't really think it takes away his dignity to read this, considering that it's addressed to most of you. He's such an asshole. I want you all to say asshole really loud. This note should be pretty easy to understand. All the warnings from the Punk Rock 101. Curses over the years since my first introduction to the, shall we say, ethics involved with independence and the embracement of your community has proven to be very true. I haven't felt the excitement of listening to as well as creating music, along with really writing something for too many years now. I feel guilty beyond words about these things. For example, when we're backstage and the lights go out and the manic roar of the crowd begins, it doesn't affect me the way in which it did for Freddie Mercury, who seemed to love and relish in the love and adoration from the crowd. Well, Kurt, so fucking what? Then don't be a rock star, you asshole. Which is something I totally admire and envy. The fact is, I can't fool you, any one of you. It simply isn't fair to you or to me. The worst crime I can think of would be to pull people off by faking it, pretending as if I'm having 100% fun. No, Kurt, the worst crime I can think of is for you to just continue being a rock star when you fucking hate it and just fucking stop.
So she gets everyone to yell asshole. Has this ever happened in history before? Where even at the moment of death, you can no longer take it seriously? Everyone is obviously very sad. In New York City, at that moment, it was a very sad moment for us. I was working again in the small independent store when I heard of Kurt Cobain's death. But to call him an asshole, well, I know what they're doing. I'm not unaware of why they're doing it. They're basically saying, why did you leave us? That's the only words they have. Because they can no longer access classic poetry, the Bible, deep emotion. They don't know how anymore. They're marooned. You know, the sense of meaning in the world is gone. Maybe we're all just literally assholes. Just parts of our body. The part that excretes. Maybe that's all we are. I'm saying that literally, but they don't know what they're saying. On the weekend where we found out that Kurt Cobain had shot himself, I remember being in this small independent record store, Rocks in Your Head, the same one where Julianne Hatfield was posing outside in front of the store for Sassy magazine earlier in our discussion. And I remember there were some teenage kids who were in the store that weekend, and they were just lost. They didn't know how to act. And as I walked around New York City, everyone felt lost who was at all connected with the music. Interestingly enough, if you were above a certain age, you had no idea what was going on. Interestingly enough, though, it made the cover of, I think it was Newsweek magazine, which Jimi Hendrix never did. Janis Joplin never did. Jim Morrison never did when they died. But Kurt Cobain did, because it wasn't, I think a lot of people realize it wasn't just the death of one person. It was the death of an era. And it would turn out to be pretty much the death of the dream of a rock and roll rebellion. There were more extreme acts like G.G. Allen, who used to take a lot of laxatives right before he performed, strip naked, cut himself with glass, and then run out into the audience while screaming. He died a couple of blocks away from my house in the early 90s. And people were actually upset with him because he had threatened to kill people on stage before he went out, and he didn't do it. There was another group, G.G. Allin was from New Hampshire, another group from New Hampshire who was friends with G.G. Allin, and they went by the name of Suck Dog. And there was Lisa Suckdog, a.k.a. Lisa Carver, who I actually got to know a little bit. And again, it was very much like the voluptuous horror of Karen Black, performing things in order to... They were shocking things, but it was almost like children in a nursery doing terrible, terrible things on stage. Somewhere between a live sex act and children screaming at each other. And yet there was some kind of meaning in it. It was this sense of, who are we? I think later Lisa Carver, got more serious about trying to understand things. I lost contact with her at a certain point. But I'm going to end here. What we're listening to right now, this thing, she and a friend of hers were sitting in an attic. And this piece is called Bronte's in the Attic. We're referring to Charlotte Bronte. But Lisa Carver, a very intelligent woman, she had been a prostitute. She was friends with G.G. Allin. Just, eventually she hooked up with Boyd Rice. That's another story. But here, she and her friend, who might have been a sexual companion, again, everything just starts to break down. The center does not hold. But they're at a loss. They don't know what to do. Everything feels dark for them. So they're listening to the love theme of Romeo and Juliet on a music box while spinning a bicycle tire. And then eventually they just start humming it at the end. And there's something so sad to me about this. Again, it's the idea, when I looked around in New York City at what people were doing in art, what people were doing in music, what people were doing in so many ways, it was like, it really was an apocalyptic mode. Rock was over. There'd be plenty of rock music to come. But the idea of rock as something that was changing society in any degree at all was pretty much over. And you know who won this war? Well, we'll meet them next time. I'll save that as a little hook for next time, number 10, when we get to the late 90s. Well, yeah, and the late 90s suddenly becomes very, very different from the early 90s. The 1990s, early 90s, was the apocalyptic mode of rock and roll. Noise culture was there. People were living differently than they had ever lived before in history. And it was unsustainable. And eventually all of that would disappear. And we would roll it up and put it into a scroll in the archives. And yet the good things, I think there was, for instance, when I hear Smells Like Teen Spirit and some of Nirvana's work, there was a sense of but we're still reaching out, even in our irony. And there was that sense of D.I.Y, which I sorely, sorely miss. Some people keep trying to bring it back, which I hope they do. I'm always doing it. Whether it's, I for years and years, I made people CDs with covers on them. And then people were starting to say, yeah, but we just do everything through our phone. And I was just like, okay. You finally got me on that one. But there was a value in the physical thing. Even if it was just made by someone who looked like a really rebellious, first grader. It was still something of value to it. There was a value in all of it. It was a cry. It was a cry by someone who couldn't admit how much pain they were in. And for me, it was a pretty amazing time. And at the same time, I walked with these people. And I felt, And for instance, being a Christian, I didn't see anyone else who was a Christian anywhere near these people. And they would have told me if there was. When I look back at the early 90s, I see a time there, and because so many of these people I knew in one way or another, some I was 1 degree of separation from, almost everyone here I was 1 degree of separation from, including Kurt Cobain. You know, I always knew somebody who knew these people, and I knew a lot of them myself. And so it was a moment. I was asked to perform a wedding in 1993. And this was the year before Kurt Cobain killed himself. But I looked around at this wedding, and it was such an interesting mix of people. And very good friends of mine, Bob and Naoko. But I looked around at it and I said to myself, this is ending. Even this dream of being a chaotic child, ironic child, a lost child, even this is ending. And something new is coming. There was one other thing I really should mention. One of the biggest events of the early 1990s was the first Gulf War. And there's a reason I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, because as we discovered with the first Gulf War and the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center, these were preludes to the 21st century. We'll talk about those more in a couple of episodes. I'll see you again as soon as I can get together the brain power to make number 10. Number 10, everything changes. But what we get from this period is the political correctness we now know comes from this period. The emphasis on the body and body modification and beauty comes from this period. So that we're about to see in the next decade or so these divas and such. They are essentially the supermodels. But now they've come to life, they've mixed with the gangster rappers and other stuff. You know, all of this stuff we're seeing here is coming back. And it's coming back in different forms. So, I'll see you soon. Subscribe, like, contribute, the rest of it, you know.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.